All right, everyone, floating vent guys back. Fresh off the Resusx presentations. Was a great time. I appreciate Haney for inviting me. And this didn't come up there, but this has come up a few times in the past couple weeks, and I wanted to just go over. I think it'd be easiest to do it this way because I didn't want to go sort of back and forth on the socials. But, what exactly is SIMV? Because if I ask someone what SIMV is, and SIMV we know is a terrible mode of ventilation, and we've gone through that, and there's plenty of research on it and things that support that we really shouldn't be using it. But I think one of the issues is that it's misunderstood in the sense that people think that it's something that it isn't. So, and I'm reading this directly off of someone else, a content creator's Instagram, about what they think SIMV is. But this person says that SIMV is, so SIMV, the vent delivers a set number of mandatory breaths synchronized to the patient's effort. Between mandatory breaths, the patient can breathe spontaneously. The vent does not fully support those breaths, may add pressure support on top. So that's fundamentally not correct. And I've heard sort of some derivation of this for a while about what exactly SIMV is, and like the vent doesn't support, it does support. So I made this graphic a while back, and this sort of like breaks down into components what exactly each mode is. So we don't do CMV anymore because CMV was sort of classic controlled mandatory ventilation. So you couldn't trigger the ventilator to get any more breaths on top of what was set. So this was initially what anesthesia used, which is why patients needed to be heavily sedated, because they would want to breathe, they wouldn't allow them to breathe, and then they would get all agitated and such. So they required deep sedation. That was sort of in the initial stages of mechanical ventilation. Then eventually SIMV and assist control came along. So I'll start with assist control. So assist control, so AC, VC, AC, PC, AC, PRVC, let's say. The assist control piece means that the controlled breaths and the spontaneous breaths are handled as the architecture that you set. So if you have AC, VC, a controlled breath will be volume control. A spontaneous breath will be volume control. In SIMV, so SIMV, PC, SIMV, PRVC, SIMV, VC, the controlled breaths are whatever you set. So SIMV, PC, the controlled breaths would be pressure control. I think when people think of SIMV, they often think of SIMV, PC, so we use that as an example. So SIMV, PC, controlled breaths are pressure control. The spontaneous breaths are not handled as the controlled breath. So in SIMV, PC, controlled breaths are pressure control. Spontaneous breaths are handled as pressure support. Same thing with SIMV volume control. Controlled breaths are volume control. Spontaneous breaths are pressure support. SIMV PRVC, controlled breaths are PRVC. Spontaneous breaths are pressure support. So if you have SIMV PC and you have the pressure control or the inspiratory pressure in the controlled breath set at 10, but in the pressure support piece of it, you have the inspiratory pressure also set at 10, then the ventilator not supporting those breaths is fundamentally false. Now, if you set the pressure support to 5 in pressure in their spontaneous breaths and in the controlled breaths it's 10, then yeah, you're giving them less support during that time. Now, this was sort of born out of wanting to weaning people off the ventilator, and the vent would do the work and the patient would do some, and et cetera. And that was, found to be sort of hogwash and it doesn't work. And all SIMV does is essentially make the synchrony worse. But saying that SIMV doesn't support spontaneous breaths is just not true. Because if you had SIMV any breath, if you are providing less support, less pressure support, so if you had SIMV volume control, if you had SIMV VC, and on the controlled breaths you needed 25 centimeters of water above PEEP to sort of drive in that volume, and on the pressure supported breaths you only gave the patient 10 centimeters of water above PEEP, then yeah, you're cutting the support in half. But that's not as a result of the mode, that's a result of the operator. So I don't know, this is sort of not a hard concept to get, but I think is an important distinction. And then it gets to the point of why SIMV isn't really a good mode to use anyway, because if you get down to it and you have SIMV PC and you have the inspiratory pressure set at 10 and your pressure support during the spontaneous breath set at 10, that essentially the only thing that's different between your mandatory breath and your spontaneous breath is the cycling. And we know that with the cycling, that's where the patient gets some dysynchrony and feel uncomfortable because you're sort of loading the muscles of inspiration in kind of like an unclear way to the brain. So the brain anticipates some sort of load, and then it's a spontaneous breath, so it didn't anticipate that, and then it creates a bit of dysynchrony. So to say that SIMV doesn't support spontaneous breaths as much or something derivation thereof is false. The difference between SIMV and AC is that in SIMV, spontaneous breaths are handled as pressure-supported breaths. Controlled breaths are whatever you set, so SIMV VC, SIMV PC, SIMV PRVC. In assist control, spontaneous breaths are handled as the control breath architecture, so ACVC, ACPC, ACPRVC. So there's a lot of reasons not to use SIMV. Another reason would be because it doesn't make any sense, because if you have SIMV any mode and then you're not giving them a lot of pressure support, then yeah, you're not going to be supporting their breaths. But it's not because of the mode itself, which sucks, but it's because of the operator who is operating the machine. So, quick sort of drop-in pod to clear that up. I thought it'd be easier to do it this way instead of sort of like having a long post, because it gets sort of lost in the weeds on like what exactly we're talking about, because some people seem to think SIMV is like a good mode still. There's other things you can do. I don't think there's any reason to use SIMV, because you can either use pressure control, or the control mode, whatever that is. And then if you think that they want to breathe spontaneously, so some proponents are, SIMV helps patients breathe spontaneously better or something of that sort. If the patient's breathing spontaneously and you have no other concerns, then just let them breathe spontaneously and just switch them to pressure support to begin with, so they can sort of control the inspiratory time in each breath and not just, the spontaneous breaths, but they still have the controlled breaths that are sort of confusing their brain. So hope this was helpful to break up the monotony of sort of what we talk about normally, and then also give a little historical context into CMV, SIMV, and AC. So hope to do more in the coming days and weeks. Appreciate everyone's support. Talk soon.